A racist police officer notices a black woman searching through a luxury car and wrongly assumes she's attempting to steal it. He arrests her without any justification, only to later discover she is a state attorney. Jake stood in the parking lot, beads of sweat forming on her forehead beneath the relentless sun. The white SUV in front of her sat unlocked, the driver's door hanging wide open as she leaned inside, sifting through a clutter of papers and receipts in a frantic search for her missing purse. "Come on, where are you?" she muttered, her fingers flying over the mess. She had already been running late when she arrived, and now things were going from bad to worse. Her phone buzzed for the third time, the screen lighting up with yet another missed call from her office. Ignoring it, she stayed focused on locating her purse, which held her wallet, ID, and everything else essential. The low hum of an engine broke her concentration, and she glanced up just in time to see a police car creeping through the lot. The officer behind the wheel glanced in her direction. Jake quickly turned back to the SUV, hoping to avoid any unnecessary attention. She didn't need this. Not now, but she could still feel his gaze lingering. The patrol car came to a stop, the engine cut off, and a door opened with a heavy clunk. The sound of boots hitting the asphalt followed. "Hey!" a rough voice barked. Jake's hands froze mid-search, her heart sinking. Slowly, she straightened, bracing herself for the confrontation she feared was inevitable. Taking a steadying breath, she turned around to face him. A middle-aged white officer stood before her, his expression stern and suspicious. His neatly pressed uniform and the confident, almost smug way he rested a hand on his belt gave him an air of unearned authority. His narrowed eyes scanned her from head to toe, judgment already forming. "What do you think you're doing?" the officer demanded, his voice sharp and thick with suspicion. Diana wiped the sweat from her brow and stepped back from the car, doing her best to stay composed. "I'm just looking for my purse," she said evenly. "I must have misplaced it somewhere in the car." The officer's scowl deepened. "Got any ID on you?" he asked, his tone more accusatory than curious. Diana inhaled deeply, steadying herself before reaching into her bag. She pulled out her ID and handed it to him, keeping her expression neutral. The officer took it, scrutinizing the card with a lingering, distrustful glare. His eyes shifted between the ID and her face, as if searching for a discrepancy. "State attorney?" he mumbled, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "You're telling me you're a state attorney and you're digging around in this car?" A wave of frustration surged within Diana, but she suppressed it, knowing that any sign of irritation could make things worse. "Yes, that's correct," she affirmed, her voice steady and measured. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to find my purse." The officer hesitated, narrowing his eyes as if weighing whether to push further. For a tense moment, Diana braced herself for more questions. But instead, he let out a grunt, handed her ID back, and stepped away. His eyes remained locked on her, filled with lingering doubt, as his boots echoed against the asphalt on his way back to the cruiser. Diana exhaled a shaky breath, the tension in her chest finally catching up with her. She had narrowly avoided something far worse, but the sting of the officer's assumption lingered. Still, she couldn't dwell on it. There was work to do, and a missing purse to find. As the officer returned to his cruiser, she refocused on the task at hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she resumed searching through the car, her thoughts still racing. Though the officer was now seated in his vehicle, she could still feel the weight of his gaze, like a shadow that refused to lift. Just as frustration started to creep in, her hand brushed against something familiar. Her heart leapt as she pulled out her purse, relief washing over her. Finally! Clutching it tightly to her chest, Diana stood upright, her heartbeat still pounding from the tense encounter. She quickly stuffed her ID and phone back inside, but the incident replayed in her mind. The officer had seen her, judged her, and assumed the worst, all because of her appearance. It was yet another reminder of how precarious her safety could be in situations like this. Taking a steadying breath, she walked toward her car, determined to move past the ordeal. She knew that once she sat behind the wheel, reality would sink in. The reality of how easily things could have spiraled out of control, how unfairly she had been treated again. But for now, she was simply grateful to have her purse and the freedom to leave. As she drove out of the lot, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The police cruiser remained parked in the same spot, a silent reminder of the encounter. The bitterness of it lingered, leaving a taste she couldn't quite shake. As Diana drove away, the weight of the encounter clung to her like a heavy fog. Her thoughts raced with what-ifs. What if the officer hadn't believed her? What if things had escalated? Scenarios played out in her mind, each one worse than the last. It wasn't the first time she had faced assumptions rooted in prejudice, but experience never dulled the sting, it only made the reality more exhausting. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her back to the present. She glanced at the screen. Her office was calling. With a sigh of frustration, she answered. "Hello? Diana?" Her assistant's voice crackled on the line, tense and urgent. "Where are you? You're late for the meeting with the governor's office. They've been waiting." Diana's grip tightened on the steering wheel, the stress of the day pressing down on her. "I know, I'm on my way. There was a delay." A delay? Are you all right? We've been trying to reach you." "I'm fine," she replied quickly, brushing aside the concern. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." She ended the call and refocused on the road. Her mind was still buzzing with the aftermath of the encounter, but she couldn't afford to be distracted. Not now. She had a job to do, and no matter how unsettled she felt, she had to push through it. The rest of the drive passed without incident, but the unease lingered, a persistent knot in her stomach. When she finally arrived and parked in front of the building, she took a deep breath, willing herself to find composure. You can't let them see. She forced a smile, straightened her posture, and stepped out of the car. Inside, the hum of conversation softened as she walked toward the meeting room. She opened the door, slipping into her professional demeanor like a well-worn coat. Her greeting was poised, confident, betraying none of the turmoil beneath the surface. But the officer's face, his suspicious glare, lingered in the back of her mind. A reminder of how quickly her day had almost unraveled, how easily her identity had been questioned. She had faced this before, and she knew she would face it again. Prejudice didn't vanish after one encounter. Yet for now, she had to keep moving forward. She couldn't let this moment define her. There was too much at stake. As Diana entered the meeting room, she straightened her posture, forcing the unsettling incident to the back of her mind. The governor's team was already seated around the long conference table, their focus on documents and open laptops. The air was thick with the tension of high-stakes business, and Diana was determined not to let anything, not even a racially charged encounter, distract her from the task at hand. "Good afternoon, everyone," she greeted, her voice steady and authoritative. She made brief, purposeful eye contact with each person in the room before taking her place at the head of the table. The low murmur of conversation ceased, and all eyes shifted toward her. The governor's assistant approached, handing her a folder containing the latest briefing materials. Diana accepted it with a calm nod and immediately began flipping through the pages, scanning for key updates. On the surface, she appeared fully engaged in the meeting, her expression composed and professional. Yet beneath that composed exterior, her mind was still wrestling with the earlier encounter. The officer's suspicious glare, the implicit judgment. It was all too familiar. How many times have I been in this position, she wondered. How many times have I been judged, questioned, or presumed guilty simply for existing in my skin? The question stirred a quiet anger within her, an anger she had learned to bury beneath layers of calm and professionalism. She had become skilled at navigating these moments, masking her frustration with poise and precision. But each encounter left its mark, a subtle reminder of the uphill battle she faced every day. Diana took a breath, grounding herself. Not now. This was not the time to dwell on injustice. She was here to lead, to strategize, to deliver results. Whatever emotions lingered from the morning would have to wait. Right now, she had a job to do, and she wasn't about to let anyone or anything derail her. "Let's get started," the governor said, pulling Diana back to the present. "I need your thoughts on the new legislation we're pushing through. We have to make sure everything is airtight before it goes to the Senate." Diana nodded, flipping confidently to the relevant section of the briefing. Her voice was steady and assured as she outlined the key points, highlighting areas that needed refinement and offering strategic changes to strengthen the proposal. This was her area of expertise, and she spoke with the authority and precision that had earned her a seat at the table, and the respect of those around it. But even as she navigated the conversation with ease, the frustration simmered beneath the surface. It was the same quiet, persistent frustration she carried with her every day. The frustration of knowing that outside these walls, she was too often seen through a lens of prejudice, her identity reduced to assumptions rather than recognized for her accomplishments. She couldn't afford to show it, though. Not here. In this room, she was a leader, a strategist, a professional whose value was measured by her ability to deliver results. So she remained composed, her focus unwavering, even as her mind churned with thoughts of change. There were policies to reform, systems to challenge, and people to hold accountable. Today's encounter with the officer was just another reminder of the work that still needed to be done. As the meeting wrapped up, Diana gathered her things and made her way toward the exit. The hum of conversation resumed behind her, but her mind was already on her next steps. There were battles to fight, not just in courtrooms or legislative chambers, but in the everyday spaces where assumptions and biases still held power. Walking past a storefront window, she caught a glimpse of her reflection. For a moment, she paused, looking at the woman staring back. She saw someone who had just faced unjust suspicion, but had also commanded respect in a room full of powerful figures. The anger was still there, simmering quietly, but alongside it was something else. Pride. Pride in the resilience that had carried her through yet another day in a world that often refused to see her for who she truly was. Taking a deep breath, Diana opened her car door, climbed in, and started the engine. As she pulled away, she felt the weight of the day lifting, replaced by a renewed determination. Whatever came next, she would be ready. As Diana drove home that evening, the weight of the day settled over her like a heavy blanket. The encounter with the officer had rattled her more than she cared to admit, throwing her off balance in a way she hadn't expected. But as the city lights blurred past her, she found herself reflecting, not just on the incident, but on her journey. She had come so far, achieved so much. And yet, the progress often felt fragile, as if it could be undone in an instant by the prejudice that still lingered in the world around her. But today, she had made it through. She had faced the injustice, kept her composure, and done her job with the grace and determination she had worked so hard to cultivate. She had persevered, and she wasn't about to let that slip away. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. This time, it was a text from a close friend. "Dinner tonight?" Been too long. Diana hesitated. She hadn't had the energy for socializing lately, her free time often consumed by the demands of work and the emotional toll of daily life. But tonight, the thought of sitting across from someone who truly understood her struggles felt comforting, even necessary. She quickly typed a response. "I'd love to. Pick you up in 30. When Diana arrived at the cozy restaurant, she was greeted with a warm embrace from her friend, a fellow professional who had navigated her own share of challenges with systemic bias. They found a quiet corner booth, a small oasis away from the noise of the world outside. As soon as their drinks arrived, the conversation began to flow with an ease that only came from years of shared experiences. "I could see the tension in your face earlier," her friend said gently, taking a sip of wine. "What happened?" Diana exhaled, setting her glass down. It's been a day, she admitted, the words carrying more weight than she intended. Got stopped by a cop while I was looking for my purse. He assumed I was stealing my own car. Her friend's eyes narrowed in frustration. Are you serious? What did you do? I stayed calm, gave him my ID, answered his questions. Eventually, he backed off. Diana shrugged, but her voice betrayed the lingering frustration. But it's just exhausting, you know? Always having to prove who I am, what I do, just to be treated like I belong. Her friend reached across the table, giving Diana's hand a reassuring squeeze. I know, and it is exhausting, but you handled it. You always do. Diana managed a small smile. Sometimes, I wonder if it'll ever change. It will, her friend said with quiet conviction, because people like you are making sure it does. One day at a time. For the first time that day, Diana felt a sense of relief, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. They continued talking, sharing stories, frustrations, and small victories. By the time the evening wound down, Diana's spirit felt lighter. The world hadn't changed overnight, but for now, she was surrounded by understanding, and that was enough. As she drove home later that night, the city quiet around her, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she knew she could face them. She always had, and she always would. Diana hesitated for a moment, her fingers nervously tapping against the glass of water in front of her. She hadn't fully processed the encounter yet, but she knew her friend would understand. She always did. Just another day in the life, Diana said with a small, humorless laugh. I was rummaging through my car, looking for my purse, and a cop pulled up. Assumed I was trying to steal it. Because, of course, why else would a black woman be in a nice car? Her friend raised an eyebrow, a mix of disbelief and knowing understanding crossing her face. And you just let it slide? Not exactly, Diana replied, her voice tightening. I stayed calm, gave him my ID, played the part. But inside, I was furious. I had to remind myself, again, that I couldn't let him win. And it's exhausting. It's not easy when you're constantly fighting those kinds of assumptions. Her friend nodded, sympathy clear in her eyes. It is exhausting. The emotional toll it takes, always having to be the bigger person, always having to prove you belong where you are. It wears you down. Diana exhaled slowly, her fingers now resting still on the glass. Exactly. You can't even let your guard down for a second. It's like, they see me, but not me. They see whatever stereotype they've created in their heads. And every time I try to just live my life, I have to fight that. For a moment, they both sat in silence, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them like a familiar, unwelcome guest. But I can't let that stop me, Diana said finally, her voice softer now but filled with quiet determination. I have work to do, people to help. The fight for justice doesn't stop just because someone's ignorance gets in the way. Her friend smiled gently and lifted her glass in a silent toast. To the fighters, to the ones who refuse to be defined by other people's biases. Diana clinked her glass against her friend's, a flicker of warmth breaking through the frustration. To the fighters, she echoed, her resolve hardening. She knew the road ahead would be long and uneven, but she was ready. She always had been. Diana raised her glass in return, a small, knowing smile forming on her lips. In this moment, with a friend who truly understood, she allowed herself to let go of some of the day's burdens. Tomorrow would bring another battle, but for now she was content to simply exist, to breathe, to laugh, and to recharge. As their conversation drifted from serious topics to lighter ones, Diana realized how crucial these moments were. These spaces, where she could be her authentic self without the weight of the world's expectations, were just as essential as the work she did every day. They gave her the strength to keep moving forward, no matter how heavy the load. The following days passed in a familiar blur: meetings, case files, and the constant need to navigate a world that often demanded she prove her worth before she was even seen. Diana found herself back in the courtroom, facing a different kind of battle. This time, it was against a legal system that, like the officer in the parking lot, often carried its own biases. Yet each time she stood to speak, whether before a judge, a room of colleagues, or a packed meeting, she felt the quiet power of her knowledge, her experience, and the people who relied on her to fight for them. One afternoon, while reviewing case files in her office, her phone buzzed unexpectedly. She glanced at the screen. An unknown number. Her brow furrowed slightly as she answered, unsure of what to expect. "Ms. Mike?" The voice on the other end was cautious, tentative. "This is Officer Martinez. I'm the one who stopped you the other day in the parking lot." Diana's heart skipped a beat. She leaned back in her chair, fingers tightening slightly around the phone. She hadn't anticipated hearing from him again, let alone like this. "I just wanted to apologize," he continued, his tone earnest but uneasy. "I made an assumption about you that day, and I was wrong. I shouldn't have judged you like that. I'm sorry." For a moment, Diana sat in stunned silence. An apology was the last thing she had expected. Officers rarely acknowledge their mistakes, especially in situations like this. She took a slow breath, her mind racing as she processed his words. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice measured but calm. "It means something that you reached out. But it's not just about me. That kind of assumption. It happens to people like me all the time. And it's not always this easy to move past." "I know," Officer Martinez admitted after a pause. "I've been thinking about it ever since. I need to do better. We all do." Diana nodded, though he couldn't see it. "We do. It starts with recognizing it, and then changing it." The line was silent for a moment before he spoke again. "I appreciate you giving me a chance to say this. And if there's ever anything I can do to make it right, please let me know." Diana paused, considering his words. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Officer Martinez, but accountability is a good start." After they hung up, Diana sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on the unexpected call. It didn't erase what had happened, and it didn't undo the countless other times she had faced similar assumptions. But it was something. A small sign that change, however slow, was possible. She returned to her work, the weight of the day feeling just a little lighter. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more battles to fight. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of cautious hope. Small steps forward were still steps in the right direction, and she would keep walking that path, no matter how long it took. Here's a paraphrased version of the script you provided. "Thank you for calling," she responded, maintaining a composed tone. "I appreciate the apology, but it's more than just that. It's about the assumptions people make and how those assumptions can affect someone's life." "I understand," Officer Martinez replied. "I've been thinking a lot about it, and I want to improve. I don't want to be the kind of person who keeps making these mistakes." Diana wasn't sure how to react. She had heard apologies before, many of them insincere or offered just because they were expected. But this one felt different. Still, the skepticism remained. Just because he acknowledged his error didn't erase the harm it caused her. "I hope you follow through on that," she said quietly. "Because it's not just about an apology. It's about changing how things are done. For everyone." There was a brief silence before he spoke again, his voice softer now. "I'll work on it, Ms. Mike." I promise." Diana ended the call, the conversation hanging heavily in her mind. It wasn't a major shift, but it was progress. An apology didn't solve everything, but it was a beginning. She wasn't sure if it would lead to real change, but she could hope. Later that week, as she walked into her office, her assistant handed her a letter bearing an official seal. She opened it and quickly scanned the contents. It was from the police department, acknowledging the incident and announcing that an internal review had been launched concerning the officer's behavior. Diana paused, feeling a cautious sense of hope. It wasn't a quick fix, just a small step, but it was something, a sign that the need for change was being recognized. The system needed reform. It wouldn't happen all at once, but perhaps, just perhaps, the conversation was beginning to take shape. As Diana sat at her desk, going over case files once more, she came to a realization. No matter how tough the journey ahead would be, she had the strength to face it. She would continue to fight, not just for justice in the cases before her, but for a world where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, was allowed the chance to simply exist. With renewed determination, she closed the file in front of her, grabbed her phone, and dialed a number. There was more work to be done, and this time, she felt ready to tackle it. The following weeks were filled with challenges, both major and minor. Diana juggled her professional duties with the heavy realities of the world beyond the courtroom, where systemic biases and discrimination remained entrenched. Yet the apology from Officer Martinez and the department's internal review sparked a sense of hope. Perhaps, just maybe, change was possible. Her workload remained demanding. One afternoon, she found herself deep into preparations for a high-profile case involving a controversial police shooting. It would be a battle, and Diana knew that every choice she made would have wide-reaching consequences, not just for the individuals involved, but for the broader community. The pressure was immense, but she was committed to seeing it through. Late one night, after a long day in court, Diana sat in her office reviewing the case once more. Just as she was about to leave for the night, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her friend, someone who truly understood her struggles. "How's the case going?" Diana hesitated before replying. The question felt more weighty than usual. She had been pushing herself relentlessly lately, without pausing to check in on how she was feeling or allowing herself any time to rest. The idea of taking a break, even for just a moment, seemed almost foreign. "It's challenging, but I'll manage. Just focusing on the bigger picture," she typed. Moments later, her friend's reply came through. "You know you don't have to do it all alone, right? You've got people who are here for you." Diana smiled at the message, feeling an unexpected sense of warmth. It was a simple reminder, but one that she hadn't realized she needed, that she didn't have to carry everything by herself. There were people who cared and understood the weight she was bearing. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to help her keep going. The next day, Diana had a breakthrough in the case. She discovered a key piece of evidence that could change the outcome in her favor. It wasn't a major victory, but it was progress, something that gave her the drive to keep moving forward. It reminded her of the reason she did this work in the first place, the people who depended on her, who needed her to fight with everything she had. Here's a paraphrased version of the passage. As Diana walked out of the courthouse that evening, her mind was already focused on the next steps. The fight wasn't over. The path ahead was still long, but it was one she was determined to travel. She knew there would be setbacks, obstacles, and moments of doubt. But with each small victory, she was getting closer to the change she sought. While driving home, Diana found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The officer's apology was just one piece of her journey, small, yet significant in the larger picture of her pursuit of justice. She understood that real change would take time, but she also knew it started with individuals like her, the ones who refused to stay silent, who wouldn't allow the world to remain unchanged. When she pulled into her driveway, the comforting sight of home brought a sense of relief. She paused before getting out of the car, took a deep breath, and reminded herself of something crucial. She was not in this alone. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been ignored, underestimated, or silenced. Once inside, She kicked off her shoes and took a moment to relax her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring more challenges and more battles, but for tonight, she allowed herself to rest. She reminded herself that she was strong, that she had come this far, and that she was ready for whatever came next. Thank you for watching my video. Please subscribe to my channel for more interesting content.